The morning sun filtered through the blinds as James Daniels sipped his coffee, enjoying the quiet Saturday ritual that had become his favorite part of home ownership. At 35, after years of saving and countless overtime hours at his IT job, he'd finally purchased this modest 3-bedroom house in Pine Creek Estates just 11 months ago. The neighborhood wasn't fancy, but it was his, the first property anyone in his family had ever owned. The sharp knock at the door came just after 9 a.m., 3 quick raps that seemed too urgent for a weekend morning. James set down his coffee mug, wondering if it was the neighbor's kid selling fundraiser cookies again. Instead, he opened the door to find 3 people standing on his porch. 2 men and 1 woman, all dressed in business casual attire with clipboards and stern expressions. The man in front, tall with graying temples and wearing a navy blazer that seemed a size too small, stepped forward. "Good morning. I'm Richard Keller, representing the Pine Creek Homeowners Association." The man didn't offer his hand. "These are my colleagues, Patricia and Dominic. We need to discuss some urgent matters regarding your residency here." James frowned slightly. He'd met the HOA president at a community barbecue last summer, a friendly older woman named Betty, who walked her golden retriever around the block every evening. He'd never seen these people before. "Can I see some ID?" James asked, not opening the storm door any wider. The man calling himself Richard seemed annoyed by the request but pulled out a laminated card hanging from a lanyard in his pocket. James squinted at it. The logo looked similar to the Pine Creek HOA emblem, but something seemed off about the printing quality. The man flipped it back into his pocket before James could get a good look. "Mr. Daniels, we've received numerous complaints about violations on your property. Additionally, there seems to be a serious discrepancy with your home ownership documentation," the woman said, looking down at her clipboard rather than at James. James felt a tightening in his chest but kept his expression neutral. "What kind of discrepancies? And what violations? I've been keeping up with all the HOA guidelines." The third person, a younger man with a close-cropped beard, stepped forward. "Your lawn maintenance is below standards. You've made unapproved exterior modifications, and most seriously, there are questions about the legitimacy of your purchase." James almost laughed. His lawn was arguably the best kept on the block. He'd even invested in professional landscaping last spring. And he hadn't made any exterior changes except for planting the rose bushes that Betty herself had complimented. "Look, there must be some mistake," James said calmly. "I've got all my mortgage documents and everything in order. I've been making payments for almost a year now." "That's the problem," Richard said, his voice taking on an official tone. "Our records indicate this property was never properly transferred to you. The previous owner had special covenants in place." James felt his pulse quicken, but years of dealing with difficult clients and IT support had taught him to stay composed when things didn't make sense. "I'd be happy to show you my closing documents and deed. The title company cleared everything." "We've already reviewed the county records," Patricia cut in. "There are issues you weren't informed about. Unfortunately, you'll need to vacate the premises within 48 hours. James stared at them in disbelief.
"Vacate? You can't be serious."
"You can't just show up and tell someone to leave their home." "We can and we are," Richard said, handing over a document that looked official at first glance but lacked any court stamps or legal seals. "This is your formal notice. If you don't comply voluntarily, we'll be forced to involve the authorities." James took the paper but didn't unfold it. Something wasn't adding up. He'd dealt with the actual HOA before. They sent letters first, scheduled meetings, and followed procedures. They didn't show up unannounced demanding evictions. "I'm going to need to call Betty Wilson about this." "She's the HOA president," James said, reaching for his phone. The 3 exchanged quick glances. "Ms. Wilson is no longer with the association," Dominic said quickly. "The board restructured last month. You would have received notification." James hadn't received any such notice, and he'd just paid his HOA dues 2 weeks ago through the same online portal he always used. The confirmation email had come from Betty's address. "Look, I appreciate you coming by, but I'm not going anywhere without proper legal documentation," James said firmly. "If there's a genuine issue with my property, it needs to go through proper channels. I have rights as a homeowner." Richard's professional demeanor slipped for just a moment, his face hardening with something that looked uncomfortably like anger. "We're trying to handle this quietly, Mr. Daniels. Trust me, you don't want this to escalate." There was something in his tone that sent a warning signal through James's mind. He'd felt this before. That subtle shift when someone's words stayed professional but their meaning changed. "I'm going to need you to leave now," James said, his voice steady. "If there's a legitimate concern, please mail me the proper documentation and I'll have my lawyer review it." "Your lawyer won't be able to help with this," Patricia said, her smile not reaching her eyes. "The covenants are quite clear. But fine, we'll give you until Monday to reconsider. Sometimes these situations get complicated when people resist." The trio turned to leave, but Richard paused on the bottom step of the porch. "Just so you know, we've already begun proceedings with several other properties in this area. The ones who cooperated had much easier transitions." After they left, James watched through the window as they walked, not to an official vehicle, but to a nondescript white SUV parked down the street. They didn't head toward the community center where HOA meetings were held, but turned in the opposite direction. James locked the door and finally looked at the document they'd handed him. It was printed on quality paper with an official-looking letterhead, but as he read through it, his suspicions grew. The language was vague, referencing original property covenants and conditional ownership clauses without specifics. Most importantly, there was no case number, no court stamp, and no attorney information, just a demand that he vacate with a threat of further action. He pulled out his real mortgage documents from the filing cabinet and spread them across the kitchen table. Everything was in order: deed, title insurance, property transfer tax receipts. He'd done his homework before buying this place. James picked up his phone and scrolled to find Betty Wilson's contact. As the phone rang, he walked to his home office and booted up his computer. Something wasn't right, and he wasn't about to be intimidated out of his own home. Betty's phone went to voicemail. He left a message asking her to call him back about an urgent HOA matter, trying to keep his voice casual, despite the unease settling in his stomach. Next, he typed "fake HOA scams" into his search engine. The results made his blood run cold. There were news stories from across the country, people posing as homeowners associations targeting specific neighborhoods, pressuring residents to leave. In most cases, the homes were quickly flipped or the land was consolidated for development. James sat back in his chair, the reality of the situation sinking in. This wasn't a misunderstanding. These people weren't from his HOA. They were trying to scam him out of his home. He looked around at the house he'd worked so hard to buy, the fresh paint he'd applied himself, the kitchen he'd saved to renovate, the backyard where he planned to build a deck next summer. This was his home, his future, his piece of the American dream. James picked up his phone again, but this time he called his cousin Michael. If anyone would know what to do in a strange situation, it would be Michael, who had seen his share of trouble during his years of military service. "Hey, cuz," he said when Michael answered. "I've got a situation here and I think I might need some help." As James explained what had happened, he made a decision. He wasn't going anywhere. Whatever these people were planning, they had picked the wrong homeowner to mess with. He would fight for his home and he would win. James barely slept that night. Every car that drove past his house made him get up and peek through the blinds. By morning, his eyes were red-rimmed, but his mind was clear. After 3 cups of coffee and hours of research online, he had a better understanding of what might be happening. He'd found news articles about similar scams in at least 5 other states. The pattern was almost always the same. Fake housing authority representatives would target homeowners, usually in developing neighborhoods or areas where property values were rising. They'd use intimidation tactics to get people to leave, then somehow manage to take control of the abandoned properties. The most troubling detail was that in several cases, the targets seemed to be disproportionately minority homeowners. James wondered if that was coincidence or strategy. His cousin Michael had promised to call back this morning after making some calls. Michael had been in the Navy for 12 years, and though he never talked much about his work, James knew he had connections and training that most people didn't. The phone rang just after 10 a.m. "You still at home?" Michael asked without preamble. "Yeah, no sign of those people yet today." "Good. Listen, I talked to some buddies who know about real estate fraud. This sounds like a land grab scheme. They pick houses they want, create fake documents, and pressure people to leave. Once they're gone, they forge ownership transfers or quickly sell to shell companies." James paced his living room. But how do they get away with it? Doesn't someone check the paperwork? By the time anyone figures it out, the property's been transferred multiple times. Makes it hard to trace, and a lot of people just leave when threatened, especially if they think it's coming from an authority. I'm not leaving, James said firmly. I know you're not, Michael replied, and James could hear the smile in his voice. That's why I called in some backup. I've got friends nearby, guys I served with. They're coming over around noon. You don't have to. Yes, I do. These scammers are counting on you being alone and scared. Let's change the equation. After hanging up, James decided to take action. He set up his laptop on the kitchen table and began documenting everything. He wrote down descriptions of the 3 visitors, what they'd said, and the details of the fake document they'd left. He took photos of his real mortgage paperwork and deed. Then he walked around his property, using his phone to record video of his well-maintained lawn, the exterior of his house, and all the supposed violations they'd mentioned. If they wanted to claim he wasn't following HOA guidelines, he'd have evidence to the contrary. Just before noon, a car pulled into his driveway. James tensed until he saw Michael step out, followed by another man about the same age. Michael was shorter than James, but had the compact, powerful build of someone who stayed ready for action. The other man was taller, with salt and pepper hair cut short on the sides. James, this is Dave, Michael said as they walked in. We served together. Dave shook James's hand with a firm grip. Michael filled me in. These guys picked the wrong house. Over the next hour, 4 more men arrived. They introduced themselves as Tony, Keith, Will, and Ray. None of them looked particularly intimidating in their casual clothes, jeans, t-shirts, one in cargo shorts. But there was something in the way they carried themselves that suggested they weren't people you'd want to mess with. All 6 of us were in the same unit, Michael explained as they gathered in James's living room. Dave and Keith still serve. The rest of us are out now, but we keep in touch. I appreciate this, James said, looking around at these men who'd shown up to help someone they didn't even know. But I don't want anyone getting in trouble. Will, the youngest of the group with a friendly face that made him look like he should be coaching Little League instead of whatever he'd done in the military, laughed. Trouble? We're just visiting a friend's cousin, having a little get-together. Besides, Tony added, crossing muscular arms over his chest, what we're going to do is totally legal. We're just going to have a conversation with these scammers. They spent the next hour strategizing. Ray, who worked in cybersecurity now, looked over the fake documents and pointed out all the flaws. Keith, who had a brother in real estate law, made some calls to verify James's legal standing. Your paperwork is rock solid, Keith confirmed. They have absolutely no legal ground to stand on. This is pure intimidation. Around 2 p.m., the white SUV from yesterday appeared on the street. It parked 3 houses down, and the same 3 people got out, now accompanied by 2 new men. One was carrying what looked like a toolbox. Right on schedule, Michael said, glancing out the window. Looks like they brought a locksmith. They're planning to change your locks. James felt a surge of anger. They really thought I'd just be gone? That's what they're counting on, Dave said. People get scared, stay with friends for a night to think it over, and come back to find they're locked out of their own house. Let's greet our guests, Ray suggested with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. They decided that James would answer the door alone, with Michael visible but in the background. The others would remain out of sight initially. No need to escalate things immediately. The knock came. 3 sharp raps just like yesterday. James opened the door to find Richard standing there with the same impatient expression. Mr. Daniels, I see you've chosen to be difficult about this, Richard said, not bothering with pleasantries. We've brought paperwork for you to sign, acknowledging the property transfer. This will make the transition smoother for everyone. I'm not signing anything, James said calmly, and I'm not leaving my home. Richard's face hardened. I don't think you understand the position you're in. We have legal authority to take possession of this property immediately. He gestured to the men behind him. We're prepared to change the locks today if necessary. That would be breaking and entering, Michael said, stepping forward to stand beside James. Which is a crime. Richard looked momentarily surprised by Michael's presence, but recovered quickly. And you are? Family, Michael said simply. Family who's very interested in seeing your credentials. We've already been through this, the woman, Patricia, said with annoyance. We represent the Homeowners Association. That's funny, James said. Because I spoke with Betty Wilson this morning, the actual HOA president. She's never heard of any of you. A flash of concern crossed Patricia's face, but Richard maintained his composure. Ms. Wilson is mistaken. There's been a reorganization, is that right? James asked. Maybe we should call the police and sort this out with them. That won't be necessary, Richard said quickly. But if you insist on being difficult, we'll have to take more formal measures. Like what? Michael asked, his voice deceptively casual. Richard seemed to make a decision. He nodded to the men behind him. Change the locks. He's in violation of multiple covenants. The man with the toolbox stepped forward, but he stopped abruptly when the front door opened wider, revealing Dave and Tony standing behind James and Michael. There seems to be some confusion here, Dave said pleasantly. Nobody's changing any locks today. The other two men, Will and Keith, emerged from around the side of the house, while Ray stepped out from beside the garage. Suddenly, the fake HOA representatives found themselves outnumbered. What is this? Richard demanded, taking a step back. This is a homeowner with friends, Keith explained. Friends who don't appreciate people trying to scam him out of his property. We're not, Patricia began, but Tony cut her off. Save it. We know exactly what you're doing. We've seen the news stories about your operation in other states. Targeting homeowners, using fake documents, intimidating people out of their legal property. Richard's face had gone pale. You have no idea who you're dealing with. Actually, Michael said quietly, I think it's the other way around. Will had been silently recording the entire interaction on his phone. Now he spoke up. We've already compiled quite a file. Descriptions, license plate numbers, copies of your fake documents. We've got enough to take to the police right now. But we're willing to make a deal, Ray added. You leave this neighborhood alone, all of it, not just this house. And we don't turn over everything we have to the authorities today. The group on the porch seemed to deflate slightly. The locksmith was already backing away toward the SUV. This isn't over, Richard said, but his threatening tone had lost its edge. Actually, it is, James replied firmly. And if I see any of you near my property again, I'm calling the police immediately. I suggest you find a different line of work. One that doesn't involve stealing homes from people who worked hard to buy them. The group retreated, walking quickly back to their vehicle. James and his defenders watched as the SUV pulled away from the curb and disappeared down the street. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Will broke the silence. Think they'll be back? Michael shook his head. Not here. Too risky now that they know James isn't alone. He turned to his cousin. But we should still file a report. These people will just move on to another neighborhood. Try the same scam on someone else. James nodded, feeling a wave of relief mixed with lingering anger. I can't believe they thought they'd get away with this. They often do, Keith said. That's why they keep trying. James looked at the 6 men who had shown up to stand with him. Men who barely knew him, but had come to his aid without hesitation. I don't know how to thank you all, he said. Dave clapped him on the shoulder. No thanks needed. But I wouldn't say no to a beer if you've got one. For the first time in 2 days, James laughed. I think I can manage that. The 6 men stayed at James's house well into the evening. What started as a tense standoff had evolved into something that felt almost like a reunion party. James ordered pizza and they gathered around his kitchen table, the conversation flowing easily despite the circumstances that had brought them together. So none of you guys actually live around here? James asked, reaching for another slice. Keith shook his head. I'm about 40 minutes south. The others are scattered around the area. Yet you all dropped everything to come help a stranger, James said, still amazed by their willingness to step in. Michael smiled. You're not a stranger. You're family. And Michael doesn't ask for favors often, Dave added. When he does, we know it's important. As the evening wore on, James learned more about the men. They never directly stated what unit they'd served in, but he gathered enough to understand they weren't ordinary sailors. The way they communicated with minimal words, their constant awareness of entrances and exits, the way they positioned themselves in the room, it all spoke of specialized training. So, what happens now? James asked as they cleared away the pizza boxes. You think those scammers are really gone for good? Tony leaned against the counter, his expression serious. They might back off your house specifically, but people like that don't just quit. They'll try somewhere else. We should do some digging, Ray suggested. Find out who these people really are and what they're after. Will nodded in agreement. I got a clear shot of their license plate on my phone. We can start there. I've been thinking about that too, James said. When they first showed up, they mentioned other properties in the area. Said the ones who cooperated had easier transitions. Makes me wonder if anyone else in the neighborhood has been approached. Michael looked thoughtful. It's worth checking out. These scams often target multiple properties in an area. Usually there's a bigger play, like a developer wanting to buy up a whole block. They decided to split into teams the next day. Ray would use his tech skills to trace the SUV and look into property records in the area. James and Michael would talk to neighbors to see if anyone else had been approached. The others would look into recent property sales in the neighborhood to identify any suspicious patterns. Before they left for the night, Dave pulled James aside. Keep your doors locked. I don't think they'll try anything stupid, but better safe than sorry. Call Michael immediately if anything feels off. James nodded. I will, and thank you, all of you. After everyone left, James double-checked all the locks and windows before finally falling into an exhausted sleep. For the first night since the fake HOA people had appeared, he slept soundly. The next morning, James and Michael started their neighborhood canvass. They walked door to door, introducing themselves casually and asking if anyone had experienced issues with the HOA recently. Most people hadn't seen or heard anything unusual, but at the fifth house they struck gold. The elderly woman who answered, Mrs. Chen, invited them in for tea when they mentioned HOA representatives. 3 people came by last week, she said, pouring tea into delicate cups. Very rude. Said there were problems with my garden and that I needed to sign some papers. Did you sign anything? James asked gently. Mrs. Chen shook her head firmly. No, my late husband was a lawyer. He always said never sign anything without reading it first. So I told them I needed my son to look at it. They didn't like that. Did they come back? Michael asked. Yesterday. Said if I didn't sign, they would fine me thousands of dollars. Her hands trembled slightly as she set down her teacup. I was worried. I live on a fixed income. James felt a surge of anger. Targeting an elderly woman living alone was even more despicable. Mrs. Chen, those people weren't from the real HOA, he explained. They tried the same thing at my house. They're scammers trying to trick people out of their homes. The relief on her face was immediate. Oh, I thought it seemed strange. The real HOA sends letters first, not people showing up at the door. They spent another half hour with Mrs. Chen, getting details about her visitors and reassuring her that she wasn't in any trouble. Before leaving, Michael programmed his number into her phone and told her to call immediately if the fake HOA returned. As they continued their canvass, they discovered 2 more neighbors who had been approached. A single dad with 2 young children and a couple in their 30s who had just bought their first home. In each case, the scammers had used intimidation and vague threats about property violations. Meanwhile, Ray had been busy with his own investigation. When they all reconvened at James's house that afternoon, he had news. The SUV is registered to a company called Meridian Property Management, Ray explained, showing them his laptop screen. Looks legitimate on the surface, but when I dug deeper, it's basically a shell company. Established just 8 months ago, minimal online presence and connected to a handful of other corporate entities that all seem to lead back to the same place. Which is? Keith asked. A development company called Urban Core Ventures. Ray pulled up another screen. They specialize in buying distressed properties, tearing them down, and building luxury housing or commercial spaces. Let me guess, James said. They've been buying up properties in this area? Bingo! Ray clicked through a series of maps and property records. In the last 6 months, they've acquired 7 properties within a 3-mile radius of your house. All the sales were significantly below market value, and all the previous owners were minorities, Will added quietly, looking over Ray's shoulder at the records. That can't be a coincidence. Tony had been pacing the room, listening intently. Now he stopped. So what's their endgame? Buy up a bunch of houses on the cheap and then what? I think I know, Dave said. He'd been unusually quiet during the meeting, studying a different set of documents. There's a proposal before the county commission to rezone this entire area for mixed-use development. If approved, property values would skyrocket because developers could build retail and residential in the same space. The pieces suddenly clicked into place for James. So they're trying to grab as much property as possible before the rezoning goes through and prices go up, and they're targeting people they think won't fight back or won't have the resources to challenge them, Michael added, his expression dark. We need to take this to the police, James said. We've got enough evidence now to show what they're doing. Keith shook his head. Police might not be able to do much yet. These guys are careful, using intimidation but staying just on the legal side of things, and corporate fraud cases are complicated. It could take months to build a case. Meanwhile, they'll keep targeting people in the neighborhood, James said, frustration evident in his voice. Not if we stop them, Michael replied. We don't need to wait for the legal system to catch up. We can protect the neighborhood ourselves. The room fell silent as everyone considered this. What are you suggesting? James finally asked. A neighborhood watch, but with teeth, Michael explained. We alert everyone in the area about the scam. Set up a phone tree so anyone who gets approached can get immediate backup. Document everything for eventual legal action. And make it clear to these urban core people that this neighborhood isn't as vulnerable as they thought, Dave added. Ray was already typing on his laptop. I can create flyers with information about the scam and what to look for. We can distribute them to every house in the area. And I can talk to my brother about filing a formal complaint with the state attorney general's office, Keith offered. He's got contacts there. I know a reporter at the local news station, Will said. She might be interested in covering this story. Nothing scares off scammers like publicity. As they continued planning, James felt something he hadn't experienced since the fake HOA people first showed up at his door. Hope. He wasn't fighting this battle alone anymore, and neither were his neighbors. They worked late into the evening, creating flyers, mapping out the neighborhood for distribution, and building a database of properties that might be targeted next. They set up a secure messaging group for quick communication and created a schedule to ensure that vulnerable residents had regular check-ins. Just before midnight, as the others were preparing to leave, Tony's phone rang. He answered, listened for a moment, then put it on speaker. Say that again, he told the caller. They're back. Mrs. Chen's trembling voice came through the speaker. The fake HOA people. They just knocked on my door. I didn't answer, but they're still outside. They have a truck this time. The 6 men exchanged looks. No words were needed. We'll be there in 5 minutes, Mrs. Chen, Michael said firmly. Don't open the door. Just sit tight. As they gathered their things and headed for the door, James felt a strange calm settle over him. What had started as a threat to his own home had become something bigger, a stand against people who preyed on the vulnerable, who used fear and deception to take what wasn't theirs. Ready? Michael asked, pausing at the door. James nodded. Let's go. The night air was cool as James and the 6 men piled into 2 vehicles. Michael drove his SUV with James, Tony, and Keith, while Dave took his truck with Will and Ray. They moved quickly but without speeding, no need to attract unwanted attention. Mrs. Chen is 3 streets over, right? Michael asked, making a turn out of James's neighborhood. Yellow house on the corner of Maple and Cedar, James confirmed. About 5 minutes from here. The plan was simple. Approach quietly, assess the situation, and intervene only as needed. No one wanted trouble, but they were prepared for it if necessary. Remember, we document everything, Michael reminded them. Will, you're on video duty again. Keith, you handle communications with Mrs. Chen. The rest of us will deal with our friends from the HOA. James felt strangely calm despite the adrenaline coursing through him. In his IT job, he solved problems with careful analysis and methodical thinking. This situation required the same approach, just with higher stakes. As they turned onto Cedar Street, they could see the white SUV parked in front of Mrs. Chen's house. A rental truck was behind it, its engine still running. 3 figures stood on her porch, one of them knocking repeatedly on the door. There they are, Tony said quietly. Same crew as before. Michael parked a few houses down and Dave pulled in behind him. They got out silently and approached on foot, staying close to the line of trees that bordered the sidewalk. Mrs. Chen, we know you're in there. A familiar voice, Richard's, called through the door. This is your final notice. We have authorization to take possession of the property tonight. Like hell you do, Keith muttered under his breath. They were close enough now to see that the scene on the porch was nearly identical to what had happened at James's house. Richard in front, Patricia and Dominic flanking him, and 2 other men waiting by the truck. One had a toolbox, presumably for changing locks. Will had his phone out, recording everything. Ray was on his own phone, speaking quietly. James realized he was talking to Mrs. Chen, reassuring her that help had arrived. When they were about 20 feet from the house, Michael signaled for them to spread out. James, Michael, and Tony approached from the front, while Keith and Dave circled around to block access to the truck. Ray and Will stayed back slightly, maintaining visual documentation of everything. "Excuse me," Michael called out, his voice calm but carrying clearly through the night air. "I believe the lady already told you she's not interested." The group on the porch spun around and James saw the shock on Richard's face when he recognized them. "What are you doing here?" Richard demanded, recovering quickly. "This is a private matter between the Homeowners Association and Ms. Chen." "That's funny," James said, stepping forward. "Because we checked with the actual HOA president this morning, and she's never heard of you. Neither has the property management company they contract with. You're interfering with official business," Patricia said, but her voice lacked conviction. She was already backing toward the steps. Tony crossed his arms. "The only business happening here is fraud. And it stops tonight." "I've already called the police," Ray announced, holding up his phone. "They're on their way. I'm sure they'll be very interested in that truck full of locksmithing tools you brought to break into an elderly woman's home." Richard's confident facade cracked. "We're not breaking in. We have authorization." "From who?" Michael interrupted. "Urban Core Ventures. Your fake shell company, Meridian Property Management. We know who you're working for, and we know what you're trying to do." A flash of genuine surprise crossed Richard's face at the mention of Urban Core. He hadn't expected them to uncover that connection. Dave stepped closer, his voice quiet but intense. "We've identified 7 properties you've already scammed people out of. We've got documentation, witness statements, and now video evidence of you attempting to do it again." "You don't know what you're talking about," Richard said, but there was no conviction in his words. "Actually, we do," Keith replied. "We know about the rezoning proposal. We know you're targeting minority homeowners. We know you've been using intimidation tactics across 3 counties. And now the authorities know too." The front door opened slightly and Mrs. Chen peered out, her face showing relief when she saw James and the others. "Are you okay, Mrs. Chen?" James called out. She nodded. "Yes, thank you for coming." Richard looked from Mrs. Chen to the men surrounding him, calculating his options. For a moment, James thought he might try something desperate, but then his shoulders sagged slightly. "This isn't worth it," he muttered to Patricia and Dominic. "Let's go." "Not so fast," Michael said. "The police are on their way. I think they'll want to talk to you." "You've got nothing on us," Richard sneered, finding some of his earlier bravado. "No crime has been committed. We're simply representatives discussing property matters." "Impersonating officials is a crime," Tony pointed out. "So is attempted breaking and entering, and fraud, and criminal conspiracy. And those are just the state charges," Keith added. "Given the pattern and the targeting of specific demographic groups, there could be federal charges too." In the distance, the wail of police sirens grew louder. Richard and his companions exchanged nervous glances. "This isn't over," Richard said, pushing past them toward the SUV. Will stepped forward, still recording. "Actually, I think it is. And we've got your faces, license plates, and company names all on video." The fake HOA representatives hurried to their vehicles. The man with the toolbox tossed it into the back of the rental truck and jumped into the driver's seat. Within moments, both vehicles were pulling away from the curb, tires squealing slightly as they accelerated down the street. "Should we try to stop them?" James asked, watching them flee. Michael shook his head. "No need, the police have their information. They won't get far." The first police car arrived just as the scammers' vehicles disappeared around the corner. 2 officers got out, looking confused at the group of men standing in front of Mrs. Chen's house. "We're the ones who called," Ray said, stepping forward with his hands clearly visible. "We have evidence of an attempted real estate scam." As the officers approached, Will stopped his recording and James turned to check on Mrs. Chen. She stood in her doorway, a small figure in a floral housecoat, looking shaken but resolute. "They're gone now," James told her gently. "You're safe." "Thank you," she said, her voice stronger than he expected. "Not just for me. For the neighborhood." It took nearly 2 hours to give statements to the police. More officers arrived, followed by a detective who specialized in property crimes. They reviewed Will's video footage, took copies of the fake documents the scammers had left with Mrs. Chen, and recorded detailed descriptions of everyone involved. "We've been hearing rumors about something like this happening in the county," the detective told them as he finished taking notes. "But this is the first solid evidence we've had. You folks may have helped us crack open a significant case. Will they be arrested?" Mrs. Chen asked. The detective nodded. "We've got their vehicle information and company names. We'll find them, and based on what you've shown us, there's enough for charges." It was well past midnight when they finally left Mrs. Chen's house. James had insisted on staying until the police were done, and the others had stayed too, a silent, supportive presence through the long process. "You should come stay at my place tonight," James told Mrs. Chen as they prepared to leave. "Just to be safe." She smiled but shook her head. "This is my home. I won't be chased from it. Besides, my son is coming to stay with me tomorrow. I called him while you were talking to the police." As they walked back to their cars, a sense of accomplishment settled over the group. They had stood up to the scammers and won, at least for tonight. "What now?" James asked as they gathered on the sidewalk. "Now we make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else," Michael replied. "The neighborhood watch plan is still a good one. These guys might be caught eventually, but there will be others." Tony nodded in agreement. "We distribute those flyers tomorrow. Talk to every homeowner in the area. Make sure everyone knows what to look for and who to call if they see anything suspicious. And we follow up with the detective," Keith added. "Make sure the case doesn't get buried under bureaucracy." Dave had been quiet for most of the evening, but now he spoke up. "We should also look into that rezoning proposal. If that's what's driving this, we need to understand it better. There might be legitimate reasons for the rezoning, but the community should have a voice in the process." James looked around at these men who had become unexpected allies. A week ago, he was just a guy with a house and a job, keeping to himself, focused on his own life. Now he was part of something bigger, a group standing up for their community, protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. "I'm in," he said. "Whatever comes next, I'm in." As they headed back to their vehicles, the night quiet around them, James thought about how quickly life could change. Sometimes the worst situations brought out the best connections. Sometimes standing your ground meant finding others willing to stand with you. The scammers had picked the wrong house, the wrong neighborhood, and definitely the wrong people to mess with. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight they had won a significant battle, and they had done it together. 3 weeks had passed since the confrontation at Mrs. Chen's house. The early morning sun streamed through the windows of the Pine Creek Community Center as James arranged chairs in a circle. Today marked the third meeting of what the neighborhood had come to call the Pine Creek Protection Committee, though James still found the name a bit dramatic. "Need a hand with those?" Michael asked, walking in with a box of donuts and a cardboard tray of coffee cups. "I'm just about done," James replied, setting down the last chair. "Expecting a good turnout today?" Michael nodded. "Better than last time." Word spreading. What had started as a small group of concerned neighbors had quickly grown into something bigger. After that night at Mrs. Chen's, they had gone door to door throughout Pine Creek and the surrounding neighborhoods, distributing flyers about the scam and collecting contact information for their phone tree alert system. People had been shocked to learn about the fake HOA representatives, but grateful for the warning. The meeting room began to fill with familiar faces. Mrs. Chen arrived early, bringing homemade almond cookies. She had become something of a neighborhood hero after standing her ground against the scammers. The single dad from down the street, Chris, came in with his dog-eared notebook full of carefully written notes from previous meetings. The young couple who had recently moved in, the Patels, brought extra chairs from the storage closet. Dave, Keith, Will, Ray, and Tony filtered in too. Though none of them lived in Pine Creek, they had remained actively involved, offering their unique skills to the cause. They had become such fixtures in the neighborhood that people greeted them like old friends. "Got some news," Dave said quietly to James and Michael as people settled into their seats. "Let's save it for the meeting." At precisely 10 a.m., James called the meeting to order. Though public speaking had never been his strong suit, he'd found himself stepping naturally into the role of facilitator for these gatherings. "Thanks for coming, everyone," he began. "For those who are new, welcome. We're here to share updates about the property scam, targeting our neighborhood, and to continue building our community defense plan." He outlined what had happened for the newcomers, how fake HOA representatives had tried to intimidate homeowners, the discovery of the connection to Urban Core Ventures, and the ongoing police investigation. Any updates from the police? Asked a woman in the back row. Keith stood up. I spoke with Detective Garcia yesterday. They've identified all 5 individuals involved in the scam. 2 have been arrested so far on charges of fraud, impersonating officials, and criminal conspiracy. They're still looking for the others. There was a murmur of satisfaction around the room. What about the company behind them? Chris asked. Urban Core whatever? That's where it gets interesting, Dave said, standing up. The investigation into Urban Core Ventures has uncovered connections to 3 county commissioners. Turns out they were fast-tracking that rezoning proposal in exchange for what they called consulting fees. A shocked silence fell over the room. You mean bribes? Someone said. Dave nodded. The FBI is now involved. This has expanded beyond just our neighborhood. They've found similar schemes in 2 other counties, all linked back to the same development company. James felt a mix of vindication and disbelief. What had started as a threat to his own home had uncovered corruption at the county level. So what happens to the properties they already took? Mrs. Chen asked. Will those people get their homes back? The district attorney is working on that, Ray explained. It's complicated because some of the properties have already been sold multiple times. But they're establishing a victims fund. And there's talk of filing a class action lawsuit against Urban Core. The discussion continued, with updates on the neighborhood watch program they had established. 28 households were now part of the phone tree. They had created a text alert system that could reach everyone in minutes if suspicious activity was spotted. 3 attempted scams in neighboring communities had already been thwarted because people recognized the tactics and called for help immediately. I think we need to expand beyond just watching for scammers, a middle-aged woman named Gloria suggested. She lived at the entrance to Pine Creek and had been one of the first to join their efforts. This group has brought neighbors together who never spoke before. We could do more for the community. Others nodded in agreement. Like what? James asked. Ideas came quickly. Community cleanup days, a tool-sharing program, assistance for elderly residents who needed help with yard work or home repairs, carpooling systems, even a neighborhood garden on the vacant lot at the end of Cedar Street. We've been focused on protecting what we have, Chris said, but maybe we should also focus on building something better. The meeting evolved into a brainstorming session. By the time they broke for more coffee and Mrs. Chen's cookies, they had a list of projects that extended far beyond their original purpose. James stepped outside for a moment, needing some fresh air. Michael followed him. Pretty amazing, isn't it? Michael said, gesturing back toward the community center. All this from a bunch of scammers picking the wrong house. James smiled. I never knew half these people before, even though I've lived here for almost a year. Now I can't walk to the mailbox without stopping to chat with someone. That's what community is supposed to be, Michael replied. People looking out for each other. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching as children played on the small playground beside the community center. So what happens with you guys? James finally asked. You, Dave, and the others? Now that the immediate threat is dealt with. Michael shrugged. We're not going anywhere. Maybe we don't need to be on high alert anymore, but we're part of this now too. He paused. Besides, I've been thinking about moving closer. My lease is up next month. There's a house for sale 3 doors down from me, James said casually. Just saying, Michael laughed. I'll think about it. Inside, the meeting was reconvening. Will had set up a projector and was showing slides of the neighborhood map they'd created, marking vulnerable residents who might need extra protection and highlighting areas for community improvement projects. We've got the phone tree working well, he explained. But we should also establish regular patrols. Not in a vigilante way, he added quickly. Just neighbors walking their normal routes but being extra observant, especially during times when people are typically at work. The discussion continued, now focused on practical steps and schedules. People volunteered for different responsibilities, signing up for patrol shifts and joining committees for the various improvement projects. As James watched the enthusiasm in the room, he thought about how differently things might have turned out if he had given in to the fake HOA representatives that first day. If Michael hadn't brought his friends to help, if they hadn't discovered Mrs. Chen and the others being targeted, the scammers might have succeeded in taking multiple homes, tearing apart the neighborhood piece by piece. Instead, they had inadvertently created something stronger than what had existed before. People who had lived as strangers despite sharing the same streets now knew each other's names. looked out for one another, and worked together toward common goals. The meeting concluded with plans for a neighborhood block party the following weekend, a celebration of their success so far and a chance to include even more residents in their growing community. As people began to leave, stopping to chat in small groups, James found himself surrounded by Michael and the 5 men who had shown up that first day when he needed help. "Not what any of us expected, is it?" Tony said, looking around at the bustling community center. "No," James agreed. "It's better." "You know," Ray said thoughtfully, "there are other neighborhoods dealing with similar issues. People being pushed out of their homes through various schemes. Not just here, but all over the country." "What are you suggesting?" Keith asked, though his slight smile suggested he already knew. "I'm saying maybe what we've learned here could help others," Ray continued. "The system we've created, the warning signs to watch for, the community organization, it could be a model." Dave nodded slowly. "A playbook for other communities facing the same threats." "Worth thinking about," Michael said. "But first, I think we've earned that block party." As they walked out into the sunny morning, James felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The threat that had begun with a knock on his door had transformed into something unexpected. Not just the defeat of scammers trying to steal homes, but the creation of a true community where one had only existed on paper before. The fake HOA representatives had indeed picked the wrong house, the wrong neighborhood, and definitely the wrong people to mess with. What they had intended as intimidation had instead sparked connection, strength, and unity that would long outlast their scheme. And in the end, that was the greatest victory of all.